What the fuck is going on, everybody? It's a podcast. Fuck, I clipped. It's a podcast. Not just any podcast, but my podcast, which is basically just like every other podcast except different because it's me doing it. I was kind of struggling to figure out. I had a few names in mind for this podcast. What I landed on, I think, what I'm going to go with is the name I use for my Instagram account and my blog and all this other stuff. It's called Overthought and Understated. What that means is, well, exactly what it is I'm going to be doing, which is overthinking a bunch of stuff and not saying nearly as much as I would like to say about those things that I'm overthinking. So, welcome to my world, Kents! I like the idea of doing a podcast. I don't know, I think in theory, as well as in practice, it may even be superior to video blogging because you can't see me. I like the idea that you can't see me. For one, I don't have to worry about seeing me when I'm editing. I don't want to be staring at my fucking face all the time while I'm editing my videos. But also, you can't see me, and I think that will make you pay more attention to what I'm saying. I don't know, I think there's like a big movement going on right now. This movement that's actually a little more primal. It's a little more natural for us to listen rather than to read or to watch something. Like, just think about it. Reading and watching, those are new activities. I mean, from an evolutionary standpoint, we haven't been reading or watching things very long compared to listening. Storytelling is the oldest form of information that we have, or passing information along from person to person, from group to group, from generation to generation. And there are many different ways these days that you can share information. The internet is kind of like this all-encompassing platform of sharing information with which you can share information in many different ways. So you would think that maybe the means by which we do that would get more and more complicated, but actually what's happening, I think, is we're realizing, using this platform, that listening is perhaps the best way to pass on information. And I don't know, I think there's like something, there's definitely something primal, but there's also something attractive generally about listening and kind of creating your own visual conception of what it is you're listening to. So I think that's why podcasting is so good. I think that's why podcasting is so popular. It's just blowing up. Everybody fucking has one. And I know I'm a small fish in a little pond. This is my first podcast. Probably gonna have like 3 or 4 people listen to this, but we'll see. Need to get a less squeaky chair. I'm like sitting on this futon. It's like making all kind of fucking noise. I don't know. I want there to be a humorous element to this podcast. I don't think it's going to focus around one or two topics in particular. I think it's going to be a little bit more personality based and just like whatever I feel like talking about with whomever. Of course, this episode is solo, and I'm probably going to do mostly solo episodes, but I'm going to try to have people on just to have, every now and then to have someone to bounce off of. I have a few friends that I think would be really good at this. Some of whom I understand very well. They understand me very well. We don't exactly agree on everything, which is good. It's good to disagree, at least for the sake of entertainment. I don't know. There are a few people with whom I disagree in a fashion which I think our conversations would be kind of interesting. So, yeah, I'm going to have a few people on. Maybe some regulars. We'll see. I think visuals can be deceiving. Like, they say that looks can be deceiving. I know that's like a cliche saying that can be applied to many different areas, but I think there's some very important truth to it. Like one of my favorite public intellectuals right now, Jordan Peterson. He's a psychologist at the University of Toronto and psychology professor, and he's been in the middle of a lot of controversy lately concerning free speech issues and the legislation of certain modes of speech. In particular, the thing that sparked this whole controversy was the legislation of gender pronouns that don't actually refer to anything that's biologically viable. One of the things that Peterson says is to pay attention. I know that's like, it's a very simple thing, but he says like one of the best things someone can do, and one of the most difficult things that someone can do, is pay attention. So often we listen to a point, and then at that point, what we're doing more so than actually listening to the other person that we're having a conversation with, we're more so, well, if we hear something that we can relate to that the other person said, we instantly start trying to connect it with other things that we know, other things that we believe, and connecting it with our own subjective conception of reality more broadly. And so once you start doing that, that's not paying attention exactly, because the rest of what the person may have to say could be very important. It could change the way that you think about your own conception of reality. Because the point to conversing is not to agree with one another, but rather to deliberate and to essentially cause certain bits of each person's belief system and their conception of reality to die off and to improve. And that's what a good conversation is. It's deliberation. It's the deliberation of concepts. And sometimes you agree on things and sometimes you don't. But whenever you disagree, it's usually because there are a few other levels of analysis, so to speak, to each of your conceptions of reality in general that don't line up with one another. So sometimes when you disagree, all that means is that you have to dig a little bit deeper into the subject matter at hand. Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of my favorite, maybe even my favorite philosopher, I don't know who my favorite philosopher is. It's either Wittgenstein or Nietzsche, at least at the moment, but Wittgenstein has stuck with me for a while. Anyway, one thing that Wittgenstein emphasized in a lot of his writing is that most disagreements are founded in misunderstandings, or at the very least miscommunication of concepts. Because what we know, and what we know most deeply, are indeed concepts. We don't really know facts. I mean, we do know facts, but facts are trivial compared to concepts, because concepts, they shape the way that we behave in the world in real time. And what do I mean by a concept? A concept is a construction of many different parts of reality, or at least reality as you perceive them, kind of molded together in a way that's consistent and logical for you. And I think a lot of what we do in conversation is like we are molding that conception. We're constantly improving it. Again, we're causing those bad bits to die off, those bits that cause inconsistency in our conceptions to die off. And then we deliberate with the other person, and we try to understand each other. You know, it's one thing to just state a bunch of facts, and then it's another thing to understand something on a more deeper level. It's like someone with a very low IQ, for example, someone with autism or some kind of like learning incapacity or something. Just because maybe their IQ is low, that doesn't mean that that they can't memorize facts. In fact, it may be on that basis that they're even better than most people at memorizing facts, because that's where they live. They lack the ability to conceptualize reality, understand it in the way that a person of average or higher intelligence does. So what we know are concepts. I don't know, a lot of intellectuals that I'm into and that I have been into in the past, I mean, including Wittgenstein, including Nietzsche, including like Carl Jung, Alan Watts, Terence McKenna, Rupert Sheldrake, just to name a few that I really like. One thing that they do, and one thing that they've each of those men have emphasized at some point, is that sometimes all you can do in conversation is to really dance around a concept or dance around an idea in order to understand it better. It's like as soon as you start speaking in a factual fashion, that's the exact point at which you're speaking with certainty, or at least seem to be speaking with certainty. And what exactly are we certain about? That's the question. Or maybe the better question is, to what degree are we certain of something? How certain can we be about something? Well, I think the higher up the levels of analysis you climb, the more broader, the more general you get, the less you can actually know. The less technical you get, but it's almost as if like the more you're searching, the more it is on those broader levels of analysis that you're searching for some kind of like singular truth out there, some simple or singular explanation of everything. And I don't quite think that anything can be explained in such simple terms, but I don't know, maybe the highest form of truth is truth in itself. Or at least like maybe that's what the conception of God actually means. It's just the highest level of truth, or it's truth at the highest level of analysis, at the broadest, most general level. And that level is a conceptual level. You know, a lot of people will argue it's like, oh, well, how can God exist on the basis of matter? You know, if you take a materialist view of the world, which many scientists do, for example. They take a materialist view of the world that states that everything that's real, everything in the universe is comprised fundamentally of matter and matter alone. Or maybe you take a physicalist view of the world, which is a little broader and a little more acceptable, I guess, for the purposes of science and elsewhere. Physicalism basically states that everything can be either reduced to the laws of physics or at least physical processes, whether you're dealing with pure matter or physical energy in motion. That process is the most real thing, or everything can be boiled down to some physical process. And I think naturalism, philosophical naturalism, has necessarily has some level of physicalism at its core. I think it must. I actually had an argument about that with a professor from Cornell, a philosophy professor who specializes in epistemology and philosophy of science. And he actually admitted, whether he meant to or not, but he admitted that he thinks that people who study science and philosophy of science either are or should be indoctrinated to take a sort of physicalist or materialist view of the world. And I don't know, that struck me as rather disappointing. And not only disappointing, but wrong. And I think it is wrong based on the idea that all we can know are concepts, because concepts aren't physical things. They could argue from a materialist point of view that a concept has its foundations in neuronal processes in the brain. But man, we don't know how the brain works exactly. I mean, we've identified, the different areas of the brain and their general functions, but there's so much overlap between those areas of the brain. They're not exactly independent working parts. They're like a soccer team who loses a player to a red card almost always loses, is because each position is important. Now, you have to shift some things around a little bit and you can win and you can still score. And that's actually what the brain does. I mean, if you take out a specific area of the brain, the other parts of the brain will try to compensate for that loss. And indeed, there have been experiments done on cats where they took out all of the brain except for its hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is a very small and very old part of the brain from an evolutionary standpoint in us and in felines and in all mammals. And the cat was still pretty normal. I mean, you couldn't really tell if the cat was locked up in a cage. You wouldn't be able to tell that the cat didn't have a brain, apart from the hypothalamus. Of course, it was hyper exploratory, but it could still function nonetheless. It could still do all of the basic things that a cat can do. It just didn't have a memory. It didn't have any medium to long-term memory and hardly any short-term memory. So it was hyper exploratory, but it just goes to show you that, we can make do with less. And I think that phenomenon and the example of the cat losing all of its brain except for the hypothalamus and still being able to function, of course, with minimal memory, is plenty enough evidence to suggest that we don't understand the brain very well. It's like that experiment's almost like an anomaly to everything that we think we know about independent parts of the brain functioning. And whenever we are using more of our brain and more connectivity between the different parts of the brain, the better we see things. And I don't mean see in a visual way, but the better we can conceptualize and understand things. And understanding should be, well, at least when we're in conversation, or if we're reading something, or if we're in a particular environment where we have to perform tasks and achieve goals, then understanding things better should be our main short-term goal all the time, no matter what we're doing, no matter where we are, no matter who we're with. It can't hurt to increase your cognitive awareness, It can't hurt to understand things better. It can't hurt to pay more attention. The more you pay attention, the better you're going to conceptualize your environment, and the more you're going to understand about it. And I think that's pretty much the main point of having a conversation. And apart from like solving problems in a way that doesn't lead to you, hopefully, trying to do so using your fists, right? So pay better attention. You don't want to miss out on something that your conversation partner is trying to say while you're off thinking of what your response is going to be. Listen, because if you listen, if you pay attention, maybe that response would change. Maybe your conception of the subject matter that you're conversing about will change. Maybe your understanding of your immediate environment will change. But I think certainly your question will change, or your response will change. Or better yet, maybe you won't have a response. Maybe it'll lead to another question. And that's good. Ask questions. So I guess that's what I'm getting at today, is pay attention and ask questions. Simple, but hard. Really, I've tried it. It's a really simple thing to think about, but it's a hard thing to do. Actually, I went on a little journey. I took LSD for the first time a few months ago, and I don't know, that was one of the main messages that I took from my experiences, because it was a very meditative experience, and I spent most of my trip alone, which is what I wanted to do to begin with. And so luckily I had some good time to myself. I thought about a lot of things, and one of the things that came to me, I guess you could say, in fact, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It was based on something that I had heard and listened to before. It was based on one of psychologist Jordan Peterson's talks. Dr. Peterson telling me to pay attention, to pay more attention. Actually, in that experience, I even discovered what my totem animal is, my spirit animal, I guess you could say, is like when Dr. Peterson was telling me to pay more attention, the image that came to mind was like an owl. He's telling me, like, you're an owl. Pay more attention. Be a better owl, because that's what owls do. They see through darkness. They see light in darkness. They're messengers because they pay attention. They get the message clearly, and then they send that message to others who need it. But first, before you become a wise guy, you have to listen. You have to pay attention. And it's such a simple thing, man. And that's the thing that stuck with me most through that experience, is like, don't do anything else before you pay attention. Know what's going on. Understand it. Conceptualize it properly. Only then will you be able to articulate it. And only after you know that you can articulate it can you send that message to others clearly and effectively. So I guess that's my message today. It's pay attention and speak clearly. So that's the podcast, episode 1, Overthought and Understated podcast. Hope you liked it. We'll see you next time.